Good afternoon. We are here to talk about Angular. This is a two-part session. The way I try and divide things doesn't always work. Ideally, I would hope to have a nice breaking point between part one and part two, but we'll see how things flow. What we're going to do today is explore Angular. We're going to look at Angular, essentially Angular 101. We'll take an empty HTML5 template and work our way up to a working application. And to keep things simple, what I did, I usually have one of two applications. Today we are going to play around with a simple to-do app. Now the objective over here isn't to try and demonstrate a true business use case. Rather, it's to understand how Angular works. Now, when I started learning Angular, there's a lot of terminology in Angular. You have controllers, you have factories, you have services, you have filters, you have route providers, you have providers. And the biggest learning hump that you hit with Angular is trying to wrap your head around all of these concepts. So what I do in this talk is we start simple, we work our way up, and each step we explore one more component of Angular. And we'll see how everything kind of comes together to make an application work. If you are the curious kind and you want to play along, or you want to go home and see how I made this application, you can go to that URL. It's loosely typed /angudon-workshop, and let me show you that in the browser real quick. So that's what you're looking for. It's Angular Angudon workshop. You want to scroll down and make sure you pick the solutions branch. Oops. And if you go to the commits, you will see that starting, well, essentially right from the adding to-dos, actually go older. If I go older, all the way from creating the first commit all the way to Ajax calls to the very end. Every single commit is there. Every single step has been outlined. Furthermore, if you go back to the root, go back to the solutions branch, there is a file called solutions.md. Let me zoom in a little bit over here. There's a file called solutions.md, and that file is a markdown file which pretty much lists every step with associated explanation. So if today you can't follow something, or you're going back home and thinking, I don't know how he did controllers or whatever, there's a 4,000 word document outlining every single step. Everyone good with that? Cool. All right, let's get a little background. Angular is now 5 years old. It's an open source project currently backed by Google, which is good news, because the nice thing about Google is they know the web. They know JavaScript, they know scale, and they have the use cases for something as powerful as Angular. The bad news is that Angular is backed by Google. How many people still mourn the demise of Google Reader? Any? Yeah, there you go. There's my man right there. Man, no replacement. But the truth is, if something doesn't work in their favor, they'll throw it away. The nice thing is this is 5 years old now, and there is a lot of open source momentum behind Angular. So I don't think it's going away anytime soon. Furthermore, they're already investing a lot of effort in 1.4, 2.0. They've actually made a sort of alliance with Microsoft to make version 2 happen. And that's a long story. If you've heard any of the controversy coming out of Angular 2.0. I'm sorry, what?
That's scary.
That's scary. I don't know if that's scary. I don't know if that's scary, if that actually makes Microsoft cool. I don't know. I can't seem to decide. Okay, what we have here is a simple project. It's a Java project. I'm a Java guy at heart. So for those who are not Java people, essentially there's a resources folder, there's a source folder, the rest is all. The source folder contains our RESTful endpoint, the back end, and something we don't have to worry about. As Angular developers, all you care about is there's a RESTful endpoint that I can talk to, show me the contract, I'm going to make AJAX calls, I know what to expect back, right? So we don't care about that. Let's talk about the resources folder. What I have in the resources folder is there's a public folder. In there, there's a home.html file, which is open on the right-hand side. I have a JS folder, which I've pulled in a bunch of Angular files, and we're going to use these as we go forward today. Everything else is just boilerplate noise, trying to make this thing look pretty. The home.html file is HTML5 document, and outside of all the noise, the only interesting thing over here is this div tag. And if I show you the file in the browser, so that's what it looks like. And please note that I'm not serving the file up from a web server, not Tomcat, not Apache, not nothing. It's a straight file open, which is nice. If you're playing along, just open up the file in your browser. You can, just like any JavaScript frameworks, you can play all the way till you get to AJAX calls. When you have AJAX calls, you need an endpoint. But up until then, we'll play all the way till the end of, almost to the end of today's sessions and see where we go. Now, before we start, let's say today you come to Devnexus, on Monday you go to work and your boss tells you, we're going to start using jQuery for our projects. What's the first thing you do if someone tells you we're going to start using jQuery? You download jQuery.js, right? That's the first thing you do, outside of reading the documentation, buying books, attending conferences and all that. The first thing you do is you download jQuery, you drop it in a folder. I've already done that for us, right? So if I go to the JS folder, I already have Angular pulled in. What's the second step? Reference it. Very good. So I have referenced it. Look at that. I'm already doing all the legwork for you guys. Now, what's the third step? You use it, right? You bootstrap jQuery. Now, how do you bootstrap jQuery? $document.ready, callback function, and magic happens, right? So we've covered the first two steps. Let's start with the third step. The third step is how do we bootstrap Angular? Now, before we go there, let's look at my inbox real quick. And apologies for this. This is probably a cluttered inbox. But I requested gmail.com from Google. Google sent me back a HTML document. And the way it works, from a single page application perspective, there's a header, there's a sidebar, and there's some sort of a footer. Now, the first thing that the browser, the server did is it got a request for gmail.com. It sent back this empty template with a single page MVC framework inside it. When the page loaded, the MVC framework woke up, and what it did is it looked at the current URL. Notice that it says #inbox. The MVC framework woke up and said, I have to display the contents of the inbox in this div right here, where you see my emails. Right there, it said, I need to display the inbox. So it turned around, made an AJAX call to the server, which sent it back a list of emails. And those got rendered there. Now, if I were to click on important, what happens is that the header, the sidebar, and the footer don't change. The only thing that changed was this div in the middle. Because the single page framework noticed the URL had changed to #imp, and it realized now I should only be displaying the important emails. So it turned around, made an AJAX call to the server, and got only the important emails. How's everyone doing with me so far? That make sense? The point of this entire discussion being, there are two parts to most single page applications. You have the static content being served by a server, and then you have this dynamic content in the middle that gets replaced depending on what the current URL is. And that is all client-side work. Going back to our discussion about bootstrapping Angular. How do I bootstrap Angular? Angular uses something called a directive. A directive, as far as you're concerned today, is something that teaches your browser new tricks. Just think of it that way. It just teaches your browser how to do something differently or how to add more functionality. So if I were to here do this, can anyone see that? I wrote the words ng-app, Angular application. And all of a sudden, this document is now angularized. What does that mean? Well, let's save the file, go back to the browser, and look at our page. Woohoo! Look at that! Isn't that awesome? All right, thanks for coming in, folks.
One question. What's the URL got to do with, how does the AJAX call to update the URL?
The URL call makes the AJAX call happen, not the other way around. So when you click on a link,
right, the AJAX call is made using the URL. Somebody is responding back to you.
no. So okay, the question up front is, what does the URL got to do with the AJAX call, right?
No, what I'm saying is, how did the URL in the browser's address bar get updated? Is because an AJAX call got made.
Okay, so you have it backwards. I clicked on a link.
Correct.
That link gets intercepted one of two ways. Either the client MVC framework intercepts it, or your traditional link which sends a request back to the server. So the second one, in this case, when I clicked on important, the single page MVC framework in the client side intercepted the request and said, looking at the URL right now, I need to only display important emails. So I'm going to turn around to the server, make an AJAX call, come back and repopulate that div in the middle.
Correct, but in traditional AJAX calls, browser's URL widget doesn't have to get updated with the URL.
Correct. Oh, so I see your question. So his question is that traditional AJAX call, the URL doesn't have to change. That's correct. But when you're thinking MVC, have you done any MVC for like Spring or something? What happens? How does the controller know what to serve back? It's based on a URL, right? The URL tells fire this controller's this method and do something. Same thing applies here. Is the URL tells the MVC framework on the client side, use this controller, get me this view with this data attached to it. Tell you what, hold that thought. We'll discuss that at the very tail end. Okay. All right, so why didn't anything happen? Well, when you think about it, $document.ready empty callback function, what happens? jQuery wakes up, goes back to sleep because it says you didn't tell me to do anything. But one very important thing happened. What happened was that this portion of the document from open body tag to close body tag is now an Angular application. This is called the surface area of a single page application. Remember in Gmail, there was a header, there was a sidebar, and there was a footer, right? Which portion of the page was managed by the single MVC framework? Only the div in the middle, right? The rest of it was managed by somebody else. Here I'm saying the server is not responsible for anything on the page. Everything will be managed by Angular. This very rarely happens. I mean, it can do it. You can reduce the surface area of your application by moving the ng app to an inner div. Now only this portion is managed by Angular. The rest of it, it assumes either there's a server that's serving that content up, or there's jQuery, or there's something else. It doesn't matter. Angular's job is to monitor and manage this space of the application. Everything else has to be someone else's job. The nice thing about this is you can control the surface area of your single page app. So if you have your company's logo and a footer, but you have a single page application that helps the user check out a product on your website, right? Let only that small portion be managed by Angular. Everything else is whoever else's problem. Everyone doing okay with this so far? All right. By the way, if you have a question, raise your hand and yell. It's a big room. It's kind of hard to watch everyone. Okay, I'm going to move this back, just for the demonstration purposes. All right. Now the first thing I do is make sure everything is wired up. So what I do over here is I use another directive. I'm going to put an H3 here so everyone in the back can see it. And I'm going to use something called an evaluation directive. This basically says evaluate whatever I put in here in the current scope. Now I'll talk about scopes in just 1 second, but for now all I'm going to do is something stateless. For example, 2 plus 3. I save the file, I go back and notice there's a 5 on the page. Everything is wired up correctly, Angular loaded, application got loaded, something got evaluated. So far, nothing too much fun. All right, let's do something else. Here's the use case. I have an input type text box. I'm going to give it an ID called first name. And I'm going to have a span. Let's just do an H2. I'm going to have a span with an ID of display first name. Now here's the use case. The use case is that whatever the user types in here should get displayed down here. If you were using jQuery, how would you do this? Well, with jQuery, you could do something like this in your JavaScript file, right? So hash first name dot val dot first name. Wow, that's so bad. I'm sure no one can see that. Let's change this to light. How's that? A little better? Thank you, thank you. I'm here all week. So first name is that val, right? Grab me that element's value, and then you can do something like, and again, this, don't type this. My jQuery skills are rusty, but you get the idea. Display first name dot inner HTML is first name. Does that make sense to everyone? Something drives the first name, something else interrogates the first name. What am I doing here? This is me binding the model and the view, right? I have a model called first name, and I have two view components. I have the input box that drives the value, and I have a display that interrogates the value. So this is me binding view with a model. I could be a little bit more elaborate, right? I could say var user is an empty object, and then user dot first name is this, and user dot first name is this. Oh, I probably shouldn't do that, right? So now I create a true user object. That's my model. It has a first name. The first name gets set by me typing in the input box and gets interrogated by the H3. Everyone good with this? Let's replicate this in Angular. I'm going to get rid of the ID because I don't need it. What I'm going to say is, hey Angular, create me a model for this input box and call it first name. So ng model is something that creates a model for you, just like MVC model, a model. And what I'm going to do down here is I'm going to say, hey Angular, please evaluate the value of that model in here. So this is first name, gets tied to this input box. This is first name that's getting evaluated. Everyone, so okay so far? Now, with this said, At the top, I've included a main.js file. And the main.js file is now empty, right? Let's go back here, and I'm going to start typing. Tell me that's cool. Oh yeah, automatic two-way binding between view and model. No JavaScript, right? This is one of the biggest selling features of Angular, is the automatic two-way binding model view. Just for my sanity, I'm going to keep the console open here in case the live coding gods are not happy with me today. All right. So back to home.html. What happened here? Well, theoretically speaking, and again, I'm glossing over some of the details here, when you initialized your application, what you got under the covers was a variable called root scope. And just think of it for now like an empty object. It's actually a really powerful object, but Angular creates this object for you. It's called a root scope object. When Angular hit this line of code, it asked this guy, do you have something on you called first name? And he says, nope, I am an empty object. So what I'm going to do, what Angular does, is under the covers, it does something like this. First name is a property on root scope, which is an empty string. Can anyone tell me why it's an empty string? It's a text box. If that was a checkbox, that would be a Boolean, by default false, and so on and so forth. Now, when it hit this line of code, it asked the root scope, do you have a property on you called first name? And he said, yep, and he is blank. So when you look at the page the first time around, this thing is blank. Does that make sense to everyone? Now, I could have done something like this. I could have said user.firstname, user.firstname. And what happens now is, instead of creating an empty string property on root scope, what it does is it says $root scope dot user is an empty object, and then so it nests it in an object created for you. Does that make sense to everyone? Cool? Excellent. Now, keeping this, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say first time and copy this twice. So I'm going to here say second time. So now I have two text boxes, both using, let me get rid of this because it clutters. It doesn't make a difference. You can do it either ways. So both text boxes use the first name property. Both of them evaluate the first name property. Based on what you know so far, can anyone take a guess as to what will happen if I start typing here? Yep. And if I start typing it here? Why? Because the same property is being interrogated on the root scope. So right, so this is not there. Get rid of this. And they both are using the same property. Now, I personally am a huge fan of global variables. I think this whole private scope, packaging scope is a fad. It'll pass. Give it a couple of years. Everything should be in the root scope, no bugs, we are good. How many of you are on the same line of thinking with me? Raise, oh, there you go, right? He sees the light. He sees the light right there. Yep. The rest of you don't seem to be so agreeable or amicable to our futuristic thought processes. So Angular has given you a way out. What Angular said is, your problem here is everything is going on the root scope. You can think of the root scope like the window object of Angular, right? It's hanging at the very top level of your application. You put something on that, everybody sees the same property. And this is a very common use case, right? You have user login form up here, you have user credit card details down here. They both might have a field called first name. They both might use a model called first name. You don't want those two to clash. You want them separate. So what Angular says is one role of controllers is to provide nested scopes, nested blocks of interested parties that don't interfere with each other. Let's see how that happens. What I'm going to do is, since I've made my point, I'm going to get rid of this. Let us write our first controller. Now, in order to write your first controller, I'm going to put that in the main.js file, right, which I've already included. The first thing we have to do is create a namespace for our application. So what I'm going to do is I am going to do var. Actually, when you load Angular, you get an object called Angular. And on that, there's a method called module. So that thing takes two arguments. There's a name, which is the namespace we are going to create. Let's call it to-dos app. And the second argument is empty square brackets. We will see this at the tail end of the discussion, but do not forget those square brackets. Bad things happen, right? It takes forever to debug why something isn't working just because you forgot those pending square brackets at the end. Because this method creates, this method gets, and there is nothing called to-dos app, and everything just topples over. All right. Now that I have a namespace, I'm going to hold on to it. So I'm going to call it my app. I'm just going to hold on to that namespace so we can use it in the future. The first thing you do is you take this app, and remember that ng app we put at the top? Now you tell it what is the name of the application. So now you double quote that name. Does that make sense to everyone? Which means my application has a namespace, that's the namespace. Everything should be tucked under that namespace. Now that I have that, I can say my app dot give me a controller. And let's just call this first controller for now. Now there are two signatures to the controller method. The first one takes a function that acts as the implementation of that controller. So it's almost like you had done this. Right? Except you take the name and you pass it as the first argument, and you take the rest of it as the second argument. That's how you create a controller. Now, that is not the signature you should be using. The signature you should be using is where this controller does not take a string and a function, rather it takes a string and an array. Just like this guy, just like that guy, this guy should take an array. And then you put the body of the function inside the array. Does that make sense to everyone? If I come to your organization on Monday and I see the other implementation, what do? No cookie for you. No cookie for you at lunch, right? Always arrays. Now that we have this, let's make sure I didn't break anything. Okay, everything works. Go back here, and I'm going to say that this portion of the application uses that controller. So I'm going to say ng controller, his name is the name I gave it here. Like so. Cool? And that's it. We've created our first controller. Now, just for posterity, one thing I should mention is almost all the tutorials online, right? You are going to see something like this. Remember, the problem we are trying to solve is not put everything in this guy. That's the problem we are trying to solve over here. So, oops. The way Angular does that is what we want is a scope for the first controller, a smaller scope that's tucked inside the root scope. So I have the root scope, which is the big granddaddy scope, and I want to create a smaller scope. So the way you do that is you use dependency injection. You say this controller has a dependency on an object called $scope. Has anyone used dependency injection in this room? Any dependency injection users? Okay. There are two ways any function, whether in Java or in JavaScript or anything. Am I sounding weird? Okay. There are two ways you can create a dependency. You can either inject it or you can new it up, right? Let's say I had a dependency on a person. I could say var p is new person, right? There are two ways to get a dependency. What's the problem with this approach? High coupling, right? I can't mock out this person because I'm invoking a constructor. Now I have to mock out the constructor and figure out a hook that prevents that new from happening when I'm testing the code. Instead, if I could inject a person like P from somebody else, I can mock this guy out when I'm testing. So the way Angular does this is it says, you want a scope object, tell us you want a scope object, we will instantiate a scope object for you and inject it into the controller when you need it. Now, in here, just to prove beyond reasonable doubt how this works, I can say dot first name is, what's your name? H-A-R-I, like that? Okay. So I'm going to say scope.firstName is Hari. Now, notice in here, I'm looking up something called first name. I'm looking up something called first name. Remember the last time what happened? The last time what happened is it looked it up on the root scope. Right now, I'm inside the ng controller. So it will look it up on $scope. And this, essentially what's happening here is now you are going to get an object that looks like this. And then everything gets stacked onto that guy. Now we've got nested scopes. Two people do not interfere with each other. If there are two separate controllers with their own scope objects, they don't trample each other. Problem solved. How's everyone doing with this? Does DI make sense? All right. Let's just make sure I didn't break anything. I always like talk for like 5 minutes and then I realize the page is broken, which kind of defeats the purpose of all the talk. So let's make sure I didn't break anything. And I did break something. What did I break? Oh yes, thank you. Okay. Now, before we go further, does anyone see a problem with a variable? So by the way, this name is special. If I call this scope, bad things happen. It has to be called scope. If you've used dependency injection engines before, how do you do it? If I say this guy depends on this guy, how do those two line up? By a name. If you typo the name, what happens? Bad things happen. Right? That's trademark, by the way. Can't use it without permission. But bad things happen. Right? So, can anyone see a problem with this? If I have a function that has a specifically named param, what happens when I take this to production? Your minifier will come along. Your minifier will look at that variable and say that's 6 characters. I'm going to call this A. That's what your minifier does. Actually, by the way, this is the perfect place for the pretext, it works on my machine. It works on my machine. Production is not my problem. It's your problem, right? The problem is this is not a scalable solution. Uglification, minification, all change param names. So the way Angular tells you to do this is you always, remember the last argument in this array is the implementation of the controller. 1 to n minus 1, 1 to n minus 1 of the array are the dependencies of the controller in string format. So that is how you define the dependencies. You say this is a dependency and that will get injected as the first argument. There's another friend of ours we will see later called $HTTP, who's Mr. Ajax. He's Mr. Ajax for Angular. If I need him as well, Angular will instantiate these two objects and inject them in the same order as they are specified. Does that make sense to everyone? Now when the uglifier comes along or the minifier comes along, what happens? It might rename this to S, it might rename this to H, right? So now this is S. Does anything change? This is just an argument nim now. It's not specifically saying scope because I'm saying scope in string format. Uglifiers don't touch strings. So you're good. Just go back here, save the file, make sure it didn't break anything, and hurry shows up. Now, all this to say that this is the way these are the examples you will find on the web. Everything today, even up until recently, Angular's own tutorials had such examples like this. But as of 1.3, Angular is changing their paradigm. Angular is saying, in this case, we are sticking everything on the scope object. And Angular is saying, let's not do that from now on forward. The way you should be doing this is you shouldn't be injecting the scope object unless you absolutely need it. If you want to put something in the view, right, like we want first name in the view, right, what you do is you add it to this. This is the controller itself. And you say this dot first name is Hari, right? That's how you do it. You are not going to see these examples on the web, but if you read the documentation, they are changing everything to be like this. That's why I spent 10 minutes explaining it to you, right? It's very confusing, but this is how you do it. This dot to tack on properties that are exposed to the view. This is the function controller itself. What Angular does is when it creates the function, it sets this as the current controller's context. Now there is one small change you have to make over here. You have to alias the controller with an as, and you say, you know, CTRL, or give it some name, and then you use that to look up stuff. So in this scope, I have a controller. The controller's name is first controller. He is also referred to as CTRL. And if I'm going to look up a property which has been stuck onto the controller itself on the this, then you should refer it to the controller namespace. How's everyone doing? This is how you should be writing Angular code from here on forward. This is not in the tutorials. This is not even in the books. This paradigm shift is happening since 1.3. Cool. So far you guys are not excited. I can tell. I have a gut instinct for things like that. So let's do something more fun. One idiomatic thing that I've seen and I tend to do is rather than saying this dot, I say var VM is this, and then this, VM dot first name is Raju. What does VM stand for? View model. So if you look at the new documentation of Angular, it's not an MVC framework. It is an MV VM, model view, view model. The controller acts as the guy, as an intermediary between the view and the model. That's the new MVVM thing that you might have heard of if you've been paying attention to this space. So I prefer to do the slightly more idiomatic VM is equal to this, and then VM.VM.VM. Whatever style you prefer. There's no, you can call it self, you can call it me, you can call it VM, doesn't matter. No, you don't. Don't return. Bad things will happen. Because the way this is set contextually when Angular invokes the function, and then the return changes that meaning. So don't do that. You've got the right context with this. Okay, let's do something more fun. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to create just a local variable called to-dos, which happens to be an array, and it's an array of objects. So up here, what I'm going to do is try and simulate what the database will do. So I'm going to create a variable called index is 0, and then an object, and I say index, ID is index plus plus, and the text is learn Angular. Does that make sense to everyone? It's just an object with two properties, ID and text. Let's create a couple of them. So learn Angular, speak about it, and we will profit after that, right? Now, because creating a to-dos variable doesn't mean anything. I have to stick it on the view model. So I'm going to say vm.todos is these to-dos. So this is just a property on me. This is the variable I just created. Everyone good? Now, based on what you know so far, how do I refer to that in the view? Right? ctrl.todos. Let's see how we are doing. Woohoo! Look at that. I say ship it. Version 1. It's good enough. Let the customers give us the feedback on how to improve this. Yeah, that's right. Let's be really agile about this. Obviously, this isn't going to work, right? Despite what your marketing department says, this isn't going to work. What do we want? We want some sort of table. We want some sort of unordered list, something to display this a little bit better. How do I do that? Well, we know we have a collection of objects. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an unordered list. And what do we want? We want one list item per to-do. So I'm going to tell Angular, please repeat. Repeat, right? Repeat for every something, for every x, for every t in controller.todos. Please create me a list item. Does that make sense to everyone? It's a for loop. If you've done JSP or you've done any of the templating languages, this is a for loop. For what it's worth, the ng repeat is one of the most powerful directives in Angular. It is incredibly powerful. Now, what do I want to put as each list item? T.text, right? Well, you could display the ID if you wanted, but ideally you potentially want T.text. What if I did T.text here? Remember, why am I saying text? Because I have a property on every to-do called text, right? So what I'm saying is there is a new t that points to the nth to-do, display t.text. How's everyone doing with this? Does this make sense? All right. Oh, probably should wrap this in an H2. Let's do that. People in the back can see. Look at that. Good enough. I say ship it version 1.1. Good enough. What's missing? Did someone say add to-dos? Yes, adding to-dos would be nice. How about marking them done? That would be kind of nice, right? I've already learned, well, I've hopefully learned Angular. I've already spoken about it. Now only I have to profit, right? That's the only thing left on my list. So let's mark them done first, and then we'll come back to adding new to-dos. How's that? If I am going, just for grin's sake, what I'm going to do down here, right here, I'm going to display an H3. Ignore this for a second. I am just displaying the to-dos in JSON format, and we'll come to what this is about when we talk about filters. For now, just assume JSON format of the to-dos. Okay, so for every to-do I need a checkbox. So what do? Input type checkbox, right? Now, when I check the checkbox, where should I save the value? Where would you save the value? On the to-do itself, right? That's the most obvious place. I have an object that represents my model when I check the checkbox. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say ng model. Remember the model we talked about earlier, which gets driven by the value of the input field? This is a checkbox. What will the value type be? Boolean. Very good. What if I just simply did t.done? Remember the first time I had first name, what happened when I interacted with that text field? Angular looked around and said, is there a first name property in scope? Nope. I'm going to create one for you. In here, if I interact with the checkbox, Angular will ask the current to do. Do you have a done property? If you don't, I will create it on you. I will set it type to Boolean. Let's see how we are doing so far. So notice down below, I'm displaying them in JSON format. If I check this box, notice done true. If I uncheck it, it stays done, but now it's false. How's everyone doing so far? Cool. Man, you're a tough crowd to impress. People like doing the wave by now. But no, I want more. All right, so we can do checkboxes. We can mark stuff done, but you come to me and said you cheated. Booleans are easy. That's cheating. That checkbox, you don't have to create the values. Angular creates it for you and sticks it in there for you. We don't want Booleans. We want timestamps because we are programmers. And if something can be overloaded, it will be overloaded. If the to-do has a done property with a timestamp, you know two things. You know it's done. You know when it's done. On the flip side, if the done property doesn't exist, you know the to-do is not done, right? Let's see if we can fix that problem. This is obviously not going to work because t.done will always be a Boolean value. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to say forget t.done. Just save the current value of the checkbox in some random property called done. And then what I'm going to say is when the user clicks on the checkbox, please invoke a function for me. So I'm going to call it mark done, and ideally put it on the controller, and most likely it's going to need the current to do, right? I'm invoking a function called mark done on the current controller, passing it the nth t, the current to do. Now that we have this, let's go back over here. I'm over here going to say vm.markDone is a function that takes a to do. And what do we want to do? What we want to say is if t does not have a done property, right, then t.done is a new date dot get time, which is basically just the time in milliseconds in JavaScript, in case you don't know the API. Now the user checks it by mistake and unchecks it. What do we want to happen? Something as simple as this should fix the problem, right? We said if the done property doesn't exist, just assume it's not done. Let's see how we're doing so far. Save this file, go back here, refresh the page, and let's see, check. Woohoo! Spoken about it, and now after I talk to the Devnexus organizers, I can check that off. Done. How's everyone feeling so far? Thank you, thank you, thank you. You guys are awesome, by the way. All right. Now, something that took me a while to figure out. So just, if you don't follow the discussion here, that's okay. I just want to point out to you that it's not always so obvious what happens here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this timestamp, and I am going to go to the main.js file, and I'm going to pretend that the first to do came back from the server as done. Right? You are hoping that I know Angular before I showed up. I'm also hoping, but that's not the point. The point is it's done, right? Now here's the problem. If I refresh the page, notice this came back as done, but no checkbox. See? So we have a subtle bug there. And that bug shows up because the model that's driving the checkbox is not t.done. It's not looking at the to-do and saying your done property. What it's saying is some done property, which has nothing to do with t.done. So we've got one binding working correctly, is I can drive the value of the t.done, but I can't correctly interrogate it. This one is a slightly subtle thing. The way you work it is you leave ng-click alone. You remove the ng model, and you say ng checked. Now the reason why this is a separate directive is, has anyone worked with checkboxes and forms in HTML? How did you feel about yourself after you did that? Did you like look in yourself in the mirror every day and feel good? It's a dirty business, right? Because you have forms, if you have a checkbox checked, it gets posted. If it's not checked, what happens? Nothing gets posted, right? On the other side, you have to figure out, oh, nothing came in, so it probably was unchecked or some mumbo jumbo. So they had to make a special directive to accommodate for that problem because of these weird behavior for checkboxes. So here what I'm going to say is you are checked if T is done. So just set the initial value of the checkbox based on some property, and after that just keep driving it based on ng-click. The one thing that sometimes gets confusing in the documentation is how these directives play with each other. So you can't use ng-click with ng-model. Why? Because they assume if you're going to do ng-click, you're going to call something on the controller which will change the model. So ng-model and ng-click don't marry well to each other. You'll see these subtle bugs that show up. Just an FYI. Just to make sure that despite all the talk, everything just works. Yep, I come in with a done. He shows up correctly. I uncheck him, he disappears. I check him, he shows up, shows up, shows up. How's everyone doing? Cool? All right. Before I get too carried away, how long is this session? 1 hour 15 minutes, right? Okay. We will talk about adding new to-dos. If I'm going to add new to-dos, what do I need? Before I go there, just one thing to point out for people who are more performance oriented. See, here's the problem. I say T in control.todos, which means that if by any measure, any one of these changes, Angular does not or cannot line up what changed with what model changed. And what I mean by that is might be a little clearer if I say this. There is an additional phrasing you can say track by t.id. What that does is every DOM element under the cover is bound to your model with this ID. So if only, let's say one of those to-dos changes, what Angular can do is you can look at the ID of the to-do that changed and only refresh that portion of the DOM instead of refreshing the whole collection. So if you have a table, let's say 100 rows by 5 columns wide, you don't want to refresh 500 cells every single time. What you can say is bind it to, track it by some ID. Now, beware, let me make sure this works, by the way. Yeah, okay. Beware, if that ID is not unique, or whatever you're tracking by is not unique, very, very bad things will happen. Now, of course, if the ID in your application is not unique, how Angular will behave is the least of your problems, right? But just FYI. Okay, let's add new to-dos and then we will take a short, well, maybe we'll take a short break, we'll see. If I'm going to add a new to-do, what do I need? And just a tip for you guys who are going to start using Angular soon, hopefully. Always start with the view, work yourself back, right? Always start with the view. Ask yourself, what does the view need to make a certain interaction happen? I'm going to add new to-dos. What do I need? What was that? Input box would be nice. Button, hey, my kind of guy. None of that Ajax, flashy, hit enter, tab out business. Give them a button, make them press it. Okay. Now, the user is going to type something in here. How do I know what the user typed in? How do I save that? ng model, very good. So I'm going to just simply create new to-do text. What type is this? String, very good. Now, just because this is an MVC app doesn't mean that you break HTML semantics. You should still have a form object. And I'm going to give the form a name because we're going to need it in a few minutes, but we'll come to that in a second. Add to-do form. Everyone okay with this? Make sense? Now, refresh the page. I type retire. I click. Nothing happens, right? Why? Because I haven't told the button to do anything. What do we want to happen? Well, we know that we should probably create a new to-do on this array, right? We should probably create a new to-do on this array and add it. So most likely in here, what we have to do is something like ng click. Remember click that we use on the checkbox, and we're going to invoke a function. We're going to say controller.add new to-do. What do you think this new to-do will need? This text, right? Now, if the astute viewer might note that they are both on the controller, which means they are both available to me here, right? CTRL is this, which means if I stick on a property called new to do text, I don't have to pass it in. It's available on the other side. But let's do that. Let's do that. So I'm going to create, oops, what is this function called again? Add new to do. So what I'm going to down here say is what? VM dot this is a, not new function. Oops. Right? And if I in here say VM dot new to do text, right? That will work. But what's the problem? The problem is that this function assumes context. It assumes that there is some property in scope available to me called new to do text, which is not generally a good thing, because if you ever decide to extract this function out to reuse it, that state can bite you in weird ways. So my suggestion, if you can inject things into your functions, pass them in as arguments. Don't assume state within your function. So here, what do I need? I have to pass in this, right? What else do I need? I need the to-dos array, right? Let's go back. I'm going to go back here. I'm just going to say text. That's what the user typed in. So user typed in. What am I going to say? I'm going to say to-dos.push onto it a new object whose ID is index plus plus, whose text is, right? Which means what? I'm assuming this, which is a bad idea. So ideally, pass it in. But does everyone see the point I'm going to make? Okay, then I'll just leave this over here. It's fine. I've made my point. Let's see how we are doing. Refresh. Nothing broke. And retire. Voila. Thank you. Cool. So retire works. Now here's a problem. Notice that this retired text doesn't disappear. Right? If I hit enter, it just shows up again. It doesn't go away. So what do I do? Well, most people's knee-jerk reaction might be to say user typed in is a blank string. What's that? Actually, this won't work at all. If I refresh the page and I type retire, it's not going to work at all. Why? What's that? No, passed by copy. Strings are passed by copy in JavaScript. If I pass in a string over here, it's no different than, if you know Java, it's no different than Java. Strings are passed by copy, which means that whatever's getting passed in there has got nothing to do with this guy. Absolutely nothing. Those are two separate copies. So blanking one out changes nothing on the other side. So what can I do? What I can do is I can say new to do. Remember earlier the first example I showed you, I did user.firstname and I said something like that. Here what happens? Angular looks at the controller and says, on you, I need something that can hold this string. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create an object on you called new to do, and that new to do will have a property called new to do text. Does that make sense to everyone? Now, instead of passing in new to do text, I pass in the object with the property I'm looking for. And then in here, I'm not getting user typed in, I'm getting the new whatever, some object, right, with one property on it. And then I do new to do dot new to do text. Does that make sense? You get an object, one property, you look up that property, set it as the text of the to do, and now if I were to do this, I've got a reference to that property. I can blank it out. I can delete it, right? Don't delete it. Bad things will happen. But anyways. Okay, so save, refresh, retire. Oh, let me zoom in a little bit. Retire, and it's blanked out. The lesson over here is your models should never be primitives. Never be primitives. Just because of the way JavaScript properties work, don't make them primitives. It will almost always bite you in ways you don't anticipate. Make them objects that hold on to properties, pass the objects around, so you're passing by reference. Even that can bite you, right? Because the way objects work in JavaScript is I have an object that inherits from another object, right? If I do let's say .name on this object, what happens? JavaScript checks with him and says, do you have a name property? Nope. It goes up to the parent and says, do you have a name property? And gets it for you. Now, if I do a set name on this guy, what happens? There is no traversal. It sets it on this object. Be careful. This behavior has surprising consequences. This is not Angular, it's JavaScript. Just something we have to deal with. Okay, now we have 10 more minutes. Let's talk about validations real quick. I'm going to refresh the page and I am going to click the add button. Oh man. Yeah, that's going to come in as blank. Dang it. Let's see if that fixes the problem. Okay. The problem here is that now that we have that object, this actually blows up, see? But the thing is, I can still click the button. Now, the use case here is if I were to do validation on this form, right? If I do validation on this form, what do I do? I could do what I just did, right? I could do something like this, right? If the to-do is not defined, then just return, and the button doesn't do anything. But we can be a little bit more elaborate. What I can say is I can use HTML5 validations. How many people have used HTML5 validations in the room? The rest of you need to get on board. If your browser doesn't support HTML5 validations, what do? Drop it. Put a banner on it which says, please don't use IE8. Was that mean? Was that a little mean? Sorry, I shouldn't have said that. Okay. What I can say here is this input is required. This is an HTML5 attribute that says the form has one field in it, that field is required. So if I save this, notice that they put this really nice red font around it and blah, blah, blah. Here's the problem. You still get this weird error and you get this pop-up that says, please fill out the field. So the spec, if you, again, I'm glossing over the details, but the spec is essentially, if a form has required fields, you can't block the submission of the form. But however, the browser will tell you some things are required, which is pointless because it's too late. So what I can do here is I am first going to tell Firefox, please shut up, right? What no validate does, again, glossing over the details, is basically hides away this, see the boundary is gone, and if I click the button, you don't get that pop-up. It basically shuts away the decorative, and there are other aspects to it, the way the form gets submitted, blah, blah, blah. That's the first step. The second step is what I can do is I can say this button should be, this button should be disabled. This button should be disabled if the current form, the current form's name, the current form is invalid. Now, take a sneak peek behind the curtain over here. When you have a form like on line 55 in Angular, what you get under the covers is a form controller. The form controller for you will interrogate the browser and say, am I valid or am I invalid? The form controller you can get a handle to it by its name. And you can ask it, are you valid? Are you invalid? Are you dirty? Are you pristine? All kinds of things. Now, you might notice this trend over here, this dollar thing. We saw dollar scope earlier. We saw dollar HTTP earlier. Anytime you see dollar something in Angular, it is something the framework is providing you. It's a way to say this is Angular's own property, not something you tacked on. Which is another way of saying that if your organization has a policy of marking private variables or anything with like a dollar, you need to stop. Because if I come in, I'm going to see dollar this, dollar that. I don't know which dollar is coming from where, right? Pick underscore, pick, well, you can't pick hash, pick underscore or whatever, run with it. But you can't pick dollar. The convention is that is by the Angular team. That the Angular team owns that namespace, the dollar variable namespace. Okay, so ng disabled. This button is disabled if the form is invalid. If I refresh the page, and the people probably in the back can't see, but I can't click the button. If I start typing, now I can click. So Angular with HTML5 getting married. If you have not used HTML5 validations, it's something you should look at, because this doesn't have to be text. This could be email. How many people in this room have successfully validated an email address with regular expressions? You're all lying to me. There you go. That's usually the answer. We copy pasted this from Stack Overflow, but there was a comment that said it doesn't work in all the cases. So we only checked for @ and dot, and we moved on with our lives, whatever, right? Not picking on you or anything, but if you look here, now this is an email field. This is an HTML5 email field. So R AJ at C, and now this is actually by the spec a valid email address. Why write any kind of validation? Let the browser do it. It's their problem, right? You can say input type number, input type currency with the formatting option. You can do all kinds of things, and then all you can do is ask Angular, tell me if the form is valid, and you're done, right? You can even do stuff like min length or max length and say 5. And now my email address has to be it doesn't work for email addresses. Duh. This has to be text. Sorry. So A, B, C. Oh, that's working. What's going on here? Oh, max length. Idiot. That was a test just to make sure you guys are awake. A, B, C, click, 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 click. D, E, click, and it works. Why do any of that checking? Just use HTML5 validation, move on with your life. How's everyone feeling so far? Good. All right, so it's 5:14 and we have a 15-minute break. Is that right? Does anyone know the schedule? 15-minute break. So hopefully I'll see most of you back here. If I don't, thank you for coming in. Otherwise, go grab some coffee, grab some snacks. See you back here in 15. Thanks for coming in. Thank you.